My name is Rick Reinhardt. I'm a consultant out of Rockville, Maryland. I spent 30-plus years running business improvement districts and being a city administrator. And then about 7 years ago, went to work for the United Methodist Church here in Washington and then in New Jersey. We're here today to talk about the emptying out of our houses of worship in our cities and towns and villages, and to begin to have some discussion with you about the problems that attend to that, but also some of the opportunities. Like many churches, we would like this to be call and response. We don't want it all to be coming up here from the pulpit. So please, we intend to have a good amount of time for Q&A. I'm delighted to have with me this morning my colleagues. Reverend Sam Marullo is the Deacon for Affordable Housing of the Baltimore, Washington Conference of the United Methodist Church. He came to that job from previously being a professor of sociology at Georgetown University. Also have with us Dr. J. Howard Kuchar, also known as Jim. Jim is a professor at the University of Maryland at Baltimore and is a consultant for an organization called Income for Outcomes. He literally wrote the book on social entrepreneurship. About 9 months or a year ago, he published a much used, much praised textbook on social entrepreneurship. I'll go first, Sam will go second, Jim will go third. We're going to be pretty quick because we don't have a lot of time. And I have brought an article that I co-authored in Planning Magazine. We actually got the cover of the most recent Planning Magazine with my co-author, Dr. Nadia Mian from Rutgers University. And I've put copies of that at one of the tables in the back. So feel free to pick one up. It's got a woman doing a skimpily attired woman doing a handstand on an altar. You can't miss it. Outline of my presentation, an overview. We'll talk about the bad stuff, the good stuff, what I call the four legs of the stools, examples, and some future thoughts. Houses of worship are in free fall, really, throughout America, from denomination to denomination and coast to coast. And whatever's been going on in your jurisdiction, it's going to get worse, not better. Why? Well, I think there's a perfect storm of 3 or 4 things happening. There's a great decline in religious membership. A Gallup poll showed that for the first time in the history of the poll, fewer than half of Americans consider themselves to be affiliated with a church or other religious entity. An increase in property costs, improved mobility and connectability. You got to remember that when a lot of the churches in your jurisdictions were built, the only way to get there was to either walk or ride a horse. Well, now we have cars and buses. We also have the internet, so you can connect with the service literally anywhere in the world. And then we have the COVID-19 pandemic, which really threw a wrench into everything. Data on this nationwide are not good. I mean, they're not great data. A vice president for research of the National Council of Churches estimates that 100,000 churches may close over the next few years, but 3 somewhat local examples. The New Jersey United Methodist, where I used to work, we rated our churches, 20% were in critical condition, probably should close any day, 40% in serious condition right behind them, out of their 530 churches. The Ottumwa, Iowa Main Street, 5 of their churches have closed, 3 more are on the way. 2 have somewhat successful reuses, but they don't know what to do in downtown Ottumwa. Gary, Indiana, the director of planning, came up to me after a presentation and told me Gary has more than 250 empty churches. There's good news and bad news about this. The bad news is we got a lot of empty churches and we're not too sure what to do with them. The good news is that means there's a lot of opportunities to do other things in these structures. The savvy churches the savvy city administrations, the savvy planning commissions, try to anticipate this and get ahead of the curve. I do want to give you one caveat. These are very different situations if you're in Manhattan or Miami or San Francisco, where developers tend to circle like vultures around the churches that aren't about to make it to get control of them, to turn them into, let's say, luxury condos or brew pubs or whatever. And in cold real estate markets, like Ottumwa, where they're just not quite sure what to do. Difficulties. There's a lot of tricks about working with houses of worship. You'll find there's an incredible lack of data on their churches. They don't necessarily even know what they own. Folks with churches have no background in real estate or urban planning. When you go to, let's say, Asbury Theological Seminary, you take courses in all sorts of religious-related things, hardly anything in real estate or urban planning. Yet, day one when you go out, often you're running a church. Emotion, not logic, runs churches. So people will talk a lot about, my parents were buried here, I was married here, my kids were baptized here. I've said that clergy view themselves after seminary as the good shepherd, not the grim reaper, to close things or to figure out what to do with them. Often churches have convoluted decision-making. The Catholics, the Mormons, are very top-down. In the Catholic Church, what the bishop says goes. In the United Church of Christ, the Unitarians, the Southern Baptists, the Jewish faith, it's very bottom-up. The decision lies with the congregation or the local pastor. The Methodists, the Lutherans, the Episcopalians, the Presbyterians are something in between, and there often needs to be consensus arrived at between the top and the bottom, which is often really tough to arrive at. And also, when a church is closed or repurposed, often churches produce a lot of human services. Somehow they've got to be relocated somewhere in the community. Difficulty with communities, and I'm including planning commissions on this, often there are outdated, aggressively enforced zoning, building code, and preservation ordinances. I've served on the Religious Land Use Working Group of Montgomery County. Often there are gotchas where the county, at least is perceived as coming in and saying, well, if you, and this is a true case, if you're going to increase your square feet by this 1,000 square feet, you've got to put in $1 million sprinkler system. You know, also inflexible, aggressively enforced property tax determinations. In one case in DC, a church ended up leasing out their basement, after it was closed, I should say, to a Brazilian jiu-jitsu studio. That technically was a for-profit use. The city came in and said, okay, you've got to pay full commercial property taxes for the last 3 years, and it just screwed up whatever deal they wanted to do. And then, I don't need to talk to you, neighborhood NIMBYs, about this. Neighbors love often having a really slow, not very much used church with a fairly empty parking lot down the street from them, rather than having something that would have more life to it. Real estate industry, realtors are impatient with houses of worship. For them, time is money. And when folks can't make a decision, won't make a decision, changes their decisions, they want to run the other way. Developers also are focused on the hot markets. They're focused on New York and Miami and San Francisco and downtown DC. And of course, developers are out to maximize short-term profits, not necessarily for the long-time community good. On the other hand, there are promises. You know, houses of worship have, in theory anyway, a community focus. Communities more and more these days are desperate for affordable housing. You'll hear more about this from Sam. And they see church property as a good site to do it. The real estate industry, not only are there for-profit developers, but now more and more, particularly in places like the Baltimore, Washington area, there are really good not-for-profit developers. going to go really quickly through what I consider the 4 legs of the stool. These are the 4 things you got to think about if you're going to be reusing or redeveloping a church. And just like a stool, if one of the legs is a lot shorter than the other 3, it tips over. So all 4 of these things are really important. And I won't go through everything here. But with the property and the property market, are there mortgages? Are there reversion clauses? A quick story on a reversion clause. My boss, the bishop in New Jersey, hired architects, put together this wonderful plan for affordable housing on a church site on the Jersey Shore, then found out that there was a reversion clause where the folks who had donated the land for the church in the 1880s would get that land back if it were ever anything but a church. Are there natural or man-made hazards? Is there a graveyard? We could talk for the next half hour about graveyards. The house of worship and the judicatory, are they ready for change? What are the rules of engagement, rules for engagement with those entities? A lot of times, developers or a community will talk to the local pastor over and over and over, think they have a deal, and then realize that some larger body has to approve the deal and they have not been talked to at all. The neighborhood and municipality, again, we've talked about zoning, building codes, preservation ordinances, tax policies, master plans. What you'll find also with a lot of churches, they don't want to, for whatever reason, talk to the city, talk to the planners, talk to the planning commission, talk to the neighbors. Oh, we don't want to talk to them until we're ready. And that's, as all of you know, just a fatal mistake. And then the issue of resources. Where's the money coming from? You'll find out that with a lot of these churches, the church property itself might be worth $1 million, but the church will say they can't find $10,000 or $20,000 to do some preliminary work. And how do we get around that sort of conundrum? Some areas of the state have great developers, some don't. Usually churches are tricky deals. You've got to find really good developers. I'm going to skip over the examples of reuse. I will point out that in some of the big cities, churches have sold for $5 million or $32 million, or in the case of Miami, First United Methodist Church, $55 million. Some churches find that repulsive, that it's God's land, we should use it for God's work, or we should use it for the community. My own take on it is, it all depends on what you use the $55 million for. Are you using it to buy a jet for the bishop, or are you using it for food, clothing, and shelter? The same, I'll skip over the redevelopment projects. A lot of those are referred to in the article. Quickly, some future thoughts. Folks need to understand, this is a huge issue. It's a huge issue. This is what department stores were to our town centers and neighborhoods 30 or 40 years ago, but it's much more difficult. Much more difficult. Why? Because there's a lot more churches than there were department stores. And how do you reuse? Well, I mean, this is like a church. You know, how do you reuse something like this according to laws and all that? We've got to convince churches to get into the real estate business. Sam and I were just talking about this. It reminds me of the railroads back in the 60s and 70s. They were losing money, and all of a sudden, one day they woke up and said, you know what? We own like half of a whole lot of downtowns and a whole lot of cities. Maybe instead of just being in the real estate, being just in the railroad business, we ought to be in the real estate business. I think we need a new model for houses of worship. The idea of single use on a hill with a fence around it, with all the doors locked all week, it just doesn't work anymore. We need mixed use sort of models that are churches and community hubs and housing and office. We need flexible zoning, building code, and property tax policies. And there need to be state and federal incentives to turn these things around. With that, I'll take a breath and hand it over to Reverend Sam Marullo, who will talk some more.
Well, Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for inviting us and sharing your time with us and attention on this challenge. Rick has really laid out a lot of the problems in a very objective kind of way. And here's just a little more data about declining membership and declining giving. So this is a structured, baked-in problem that we're facing at the church level. And I taught at the seminary for the last decade at Wesley Theological Seminary, and so this is a big topic of conversation among seminarians. What do we do with our market? Basically, is disappearing before our eyes, and the way that we talk about this at the seminary is that we've lost our mission, we've lost our focus, and I'm not going to present any of that material here because that's not your interest or concern about, what's the mission of the church to be about making disciples, and what does that mean about serving God and building the kingdom of God in this place. That's the kind of language for the seminaries to talk about. But the problem that Rick mentioned about, but clergy are actually asked to then go out into the community coming straight out of seminary and be property managers and being real estate developers, and they've never had any courses in any of that, and so they need a lot of help, and we as an entire denomination needs a lot of help along these lines. We have just so I'm representing the United Methodist Church here, and we divide ourselves up into conferences. You may think diocese if you're Catholic or Episcopalian. It's a geographic territory. We cover the state of Maryland and D.C., and there are 600 churches in that area. That's a lot of real estate, 600 churches. Just in the greater Washington metro area, I'm in D.C., just inside the beltway, basically, of the D.C. beltway. We have 60-plus churches and another 70 churches in Montgomery and Prince George's County. So that's a lot of real estate just in a pretty concentrated area. And basically, I think I can say this fairly, none of the clergy has any clue about real estate development or what to do with their property and how to be an appropriate building manager. So we've got buildings that are falling apart. I've been through, probably 50 or 60 buildings in the last few years, especially with COVID and the pandemic and the lockdown and people being out of their churches, but we've had to wear hazmat suits to get into some of the buildings. There's been so much mold and poor quality air where the building has just been basically locked up for years with water damage and mold growing out of every entity of the building. And that's that building in the upper right corner. In fact, that's a beautiful building on the outside and looks beautiful to the neighbors. And yet you can't walk into it without literally a hazmat suit on. So we're stuck with these properties. That one, in fact, is historically zoned. So what is the church to do with that? Well, we would like to build affordable housing in that space, but of course it's landlocked and there's no room for parking, and the neighbors don't want any poor people in their neighborhood. So we're stuck with this building that's falling apart and can't figure out what to do with it. So I won't get into the weeds about all of these kinds of buildings that we are faced with, but the local clergy don't know what to do with these, and the conference, that is the bishop and the bishop's staff, doesn't know what to do with them. So some conferences are starting to create community development corporations that will bring in the expertise to help us to figure some of this out. But we've had a couple of false starts along those lines, too, because development's not easy and requires a lot of money. And, of course, denominations and local churches don't have a lot of money sitting around to use for guarantees and engineering studies and technical studies and everything else, and zoning changes that I'll come back to in a moment. So we see this problem at the church level as loss of mission, but we also aren't institutionally organized to handle this. And honestly, we see that is even a distraction sometimes. Becoming property managers and real estate developers takes you away from doing the work of the church in some people's understanding. Oops, wrong button here. the wrong button here. So we've tried to, in our conference here in the Methodist Church, we've tried to build this in with strategic planning, and we think that's the right way to go, to tie this in with the way we want to reclaim mission and deepen discipleship, to live and love people like Jesus, and to multiply our impact. So there's a whole lot of sermons in there. I won't even go down that road at all with you. But for those of you that know the being a wise steward of your resources, lots of parables about that. So we have lots of good teaching material. But where we want to go is really asking these are harder questions. Does the property serve our mission? Or are we making an idol of it? You know, as Rick mentioned, that case of, you know, I was baptized here, my parents were married here. The one that I hear most often is, I just want the church to be open when I'm carried out the door, you know, for my funeral. So this is, you know, I'm going to be carried out the 5th Street door so I can be buried here at this church. And then the cemeteries are a total nightmare to try to figure out what to do with those. And then finally, are we being wise as serpents, yet innocent as doves? So this is a great scriptural line, and the way that gets understood is that every real estate developer and real estate agent is out to screw us out of our property. So we're just going to be taken advantage of if we try to do anything in the real estate world, and so we just better not do anything. And so that's fear that's driving the agenda at a lot of local churches. Okay, so we've set up this working group, property and purpose group at the conference level, asking these questions very specifically. Our sanctuaries, as Rick mentioned, this looks like a sanctuary. What do you do with your sanctuary the other 167 hours a week, the 1 hour a week that you're in worship, but then the other 6 days and 23 hours, what are you doing with that space? We have a lot of parsonages and other buildings, the place where the clergy used to live and often have been converted now into food hubs or clothing pantries. Is that the best use of that property? And then finally, undeveloped land. We literally have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres of undeveloped land, parking lots that are no longer needed. What can we do with those? And so we've been working to figure out what are alternative uses of this property. The challenges, let me just identify some of these challenges. The lack of capacity, again, I mentioned we don't have the expertise to know what to do with these pieces of property. We don't have the experience. We don't have the financial capacity to use for initial studies, feasibility studies. We've developed a relationship with Georgetown University's real estate program, a master's program in real estate, and their students for their master's thesis do feasibility studies. And so we now get a student assigned to a church over the course of a semester. The student will do a feasibility study on the church. What are the alternative uses? Could this be developed as affordable housing? What would the financials look like? What would the costs be? How could it be paid for? What are the market comps in this community, and so on? So every semester we're doing about 6 new feasibility studies. The program loves these projects, and so if you know of folks that need a study done, I've actually got application forms that I can share with you after the presentation, and have a feasibility study done on a piece of property of interest, whether it's a church, a house of worship, or just an empty piece of property. They're looking for real pieces of property to do feasibility studies on them. In order to address this, as I said, you know, the challenges. Let me just go back. The zoning. I'll come back to that. I'll come back to each one of these in just a second. The organizational problems that the church itself doesn't have a nonprofit or a community development corporation to do this work. And we're plagued by a set of internal operating rules that makes it incredibly difficult. In our denomination, it's called a book of discipline. It's the rule book, the constitution for Methodist churches and how church property is owned. You may have heard the term trust clause. The local church owns the property in trust for the larger denomination. So what that means is even though the local church pays and operates and manages the property, it can't do anything substantial to it without permission of the larger church. So everything needs to get approved by at least 2 other higher levels of organization, and those other levels aren't really well organized to review and assess and facilitate in a timely manner a development project that a local church may want to undertake. So we have lots and lots of examples of local churches wanting to move forward, but spending months and literally years trying to get approvals from the higher up levels in order to move a project forward. And by that time, the money's disappeared, or the developer's disappeared, or the opportunity has just kind of vanished. Okay, so I mentioned in order to increase our capacity, we simply need ways to invest in the expertise that's needed and to accumulate the financial resources that are needed. So creating our own nonprofits to work with the local churches is the path that we're pursuing to do that. And I mentioned our collaboration with Georgetown to get feasibility studies. Zoning, this is a big issue that churches are typically zoned residential for the neighborhood that they were built in, and once you have a residential zoning tagged on the property, it makes any kind of development for affordable housing or any other higher density development very time-consuming, costly to change, and possibly setting off the neighbors in a NIMBY movement against the project. So coming up with ways of doing exemptions, special exemptions, or by right development. Montgomery County is putting some legislation together for exemptions to allow the zoning just to be removed from the church property and to allow for higher density development in as long as the project is for 100% affordable housing. Many of you know there are special exemptions for seniors or special needs housing already on the books, but how they get applied, DC has those special exemptions, but then when it comes time to actually put them, to get them to apply them, nobody wants to take responsibility for making that decision, and so again it languishes. I mentioned our own kind of incorporated challenges that aren't typically organized as community development corporations, don't have the expertise or the money to manage this, and the legal challenges of keeping separate pots of money for development. We've had a bishop a while back in this area that got into trouble for mixing pots of money from one purpose to applying them to development projects. And then, as I mentioned, the denominational complications. I've spent the last couple of years working on a handbook for the local churches to go through our book of discipline, and we have 30 steps. You imagine that 30 steps just on the church side of things for a project to come to fruition, which is ridiculous to expect a local clergy or a local volunteer trustee board to understand these 30 steps that are required to get all the approvals that are needed to move a project from a vision into a reality and groundbreaking for the project. So we have that handbook that we now at least have that as a tool to help the local church to move through this process. And just thinking of ways that you all could help through planning agencies, thinking about Rick had mentioned the Montgomery County Religious Land Use Working Group. That's been incredibly helpful for helping to educate clergy leaders, helping to educate the lay leaders in the community as to what the zoning and other requirements are for moving forward on development. Something that we've talked about doing, and I think, again, in Montgomery County, we might be moving forward, is using property tax databases. Again, I mentioned 600 properties throughout the state of Maryland, using the tax database to do a simple search, set up some parameters, what are faith-based owned properties that have X amount of square footage that could be developed. I think our Montgomery County folks are going to do that, and we're going to end up with hundreds of pieces of property that are potential development sites. And then thinking of how do we create zoning exemptions to expedite the process, to move that forward, and how can we earmark some resources to help congregations that want to do this kind of work to move forward. Again, Enterprise Community Partners has done this kind of work through their faith-based development initiative to fund basically training programs for clergy and lay leaders that want to move these projects forward. So I'll stop there and pass this on to Jim.
Thank you, Sam. Yep. This is all Sam's support material, by the way, so just demonstrating his bona fides here. So my name is Jim Kuchar. I do a lot of things, but one of the things I do is I work with area nonprofits and with churches. And my particular area of expertise is underutilized assets. And you heard the conversation earlier with my friends here about this notion of stewardship in churches. And one of the things I say to congregations when I work with them is it really being a good steward of a building that sits empty 6.5 days a week? Is that really the best way you can use that building? And you've heard a lot of talk about housing. One of the points that I bring up is that housing is not the only option that you have on the table here. So, typical church real estate deal, you have a building that's falling down, we knock it down, we turn it into affordable housing, right? There are great stories about this all over the country. It makes money. The church, as Rick said, gets a nice big chunk of change in their pocket that they can use to do other good things with. And there are a lot of really good success stories about this. But there's a lot of other things you can do, particularly as preventative actions before you get to that stage. So before the building collapses, you can do things that can give the congregation, at the very least, a little time and a little breathing room to figure out what they want to do with the building long term. I'm going to very quickly run you through a couple of cases. These are real churches that I've worked with. The names have been changed to protect the guilty, but we'll just kind of walk through these real quick. So, Fellowship Hall, right? Every church has some sort of gathering space where they eat and talk and do other things. Fellowship Hall, rented out as a yoga studio, can generate between $50,000 and $75,000 of additional annual net revenue to the church. So when I say net, make sure, those of you that do finance understand after expenses. If you talk to a congregation and say, I'm going to bump your budget up by $50,000, they do backflips. It's amazing. Church kitchens. They've all got kitchens of some sort. If the kitchen happens to be commercial grade, which a lot of them are, you turn that into a commissary kitchen, and again, you're not even using it when the congregation needs it. You can generate $15,000 to $30,000 net additional revenue for a congregation. Parsonages turned into office space, $25,000 to $50,000 in additional net revenue to the congregation. Sunday school buildings into daycare centers, $20,000 to $60,000 of additional revenue. So, it provides a nice budget boost. It gives you time and space to do the long-term strategic planning. Believe it or not, it actually gets people in the building, which is one of the things churches like to see. You do have to do feasibility about it. Obviously, there are times where there are zoning issues that you have to get through. But in my experience, these kind of adaptive reuses, small a, small r, are a lot easier to get through than we're going to knock the thing down and build apartments. Yes, housing is a huge need, but it's also a heavy lift. And then when it's really aligned with the congregation's vibe, and I use that word on purpose as opposed to mission, because mission becomes very fuzzy and you get all these sorts of mom and apple pie kind of conversations going on. When it really resonates with the church's vibe, I'm working with a congregation right now where they're all about food, and what we think we're going to end up doing with them is actually turning, they've got about 7 acres of land, we're going to turn it into gardens that they're going to grow and then sell, not give away, sell the produce. So that's just a couple of quick sketches. I know we want to have a couple of minutes for folks to sort of throw rocks at what we've thrown at you. So thank you.
My name is Lynn Harris, and we have family members in the cemetery, right? And we having issues with the church as far as like being responsible for maintaining the cemetery. Is there anything that could be done where we could respect the remains of our loved ones, and the church will have some type of grant or something to help maintain it, or make some type of situation out of it, or historical society issue?
I'm giving that one to the theologian.
That is a tough one, and we see that problem a lot, and there's no simple answer. Our conference has created a nonprofit to help churches that are struggling financially to maintain their cemeteries, to bring in the resources that they need to do that properly. And I think local churches and different denominations are handling that differently. So I don't have a good answer to that.
I only wanted to add quickly to that. If a church has a graveyard and the church sells to a developer, often there's a problem because it's all in one lot, and you end up having to get the lots divided. Sometimes there needs to be the ability to use some of the other property to help maintain the cemetery or the graveyard. It's really tricky.
You don't want to go there.
We don't want to go there.
Hi, my name is Emily Brophy. I'm a Baltimore County Planning Board member. So quick question. I mean, this was interesting. We do have a lot of churches in Baltimore County, that's for sure. What type of outreach have you guys done to private developers in reference to potentially JV partnering with you, right? Like you're clearly not, like you said, a property manager or a developer, but potentially there are some private partnerships that can be had with you guys, and I'm just kind of curious where you are with that.
Yeah, that is the route I think that most of our churches are going and will end up going, at least in the short run, to work with private, more often nonprofit developers that have a mission focus. Mission First being like one of those in the region that does that kind of work, or the community builders. There's a handful of nonprofit developers that we're working with and kind of developing the templates for doing that work. There's still a huge power and financial imbalance in entering into those partnerships. So it's a pretty delicate dance when we're trying to set those up.
The other thing that I would say is that the judicatories, the governing bodies, the diocese, I'm a Presbyterian, it's the presbytery, that sort of regional oversight group within any denomination is really where the outreach has to happen, because most of the times they either literally hold the title or they metaphorically hold the title to the property. I sat on one of those boards for a number of years, and it's a mess just getting those folks to think about this way. So, and often the developer approaching those folks is viewed with a rather large amount of distaste because they're seen as being opportunistic. So I think the real outreach, and the place I know that my colleagues and I are working, is more at those religious governing entities.
Jessica Andritz, I'm the Director of Land Use and Growth Management for St. Mary's County. Good morning. I don't think I've ever been accused of not speaking loudly. So I have two questions. The first question is in relation to zoning. So have you had any experience with local jurisdictions that are willing and able to find some flexibility within their zoning code, or perhaps a zoning text amendment, that would allow sort of a joint use between, let's say traditional, house of worship, and you showed the yoga studio. So we'll say some recreational facility. That's number one. And number two, I realize that none of you are tax professionals, but have you run into or experienced situations where a church would hit a roadblock and couldn't use the facility as a community recreational facility because they don't hire Zumba professionals on staff, and so you get an issue with the nonprofit status?
So I can take the second question. I'm going to dump the first one to these two guys. The tax issue is a non-issue. One of the biggest issues in nonprofits in general is this notion of, as soon as we make money, we violate our nonprofit status. That is 100% false, okay? The rule in the nonprofit status is unrelated business income, okay? If you look at, and churches, by the way, are nonprofits by definition. They actually don't have to file to be a nonprofit. They are nonprofits by definition, according to the IRS, okay? So if you've got income that's coming in that drives the mission, right? Because that's what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is you rent the building out, but the money comes in to feed other things, right? It comes in to fill those holes in the church budget. You're usually okay. The other thing is that the IRS is not really looking for, St. John's United Methodist tax return to come in and audit. They're looking for some guy with orange hair and a red tie.
I'll just comment on the zoning question that we're struggling and advocating for zoning changes to make that more flexible, but we have, and Montgomery County seems to be the most friendly, and that maybe makes sense because the property values there are so incredibly high, and the need for affordable housing is desperate there, so they're responding. But not many other places are responding that way to provide that kind of flexibility to enable the development of affordable housing on R1 zoned property, basically. For the default is to go for single family homes on sizable lots, and that just doesn't work for affordable housing.
5 or 6 cities nationwide, San Antonio, San Diego, Seattle, Atlanta, have passed legislation that gives churches additional zoning by right if they are building affordable housing. So they have actually passed legislation saying that. The state of California just passed legislation doing the same thing. It's good and it's bad, because I agree with Jim, not all of these projects should be 100% affordable housing. Maybe some ought to be 20% affordable housing. Maybe some of them ought to be arts and cultural centers. I would also say that building codes are as big a hurdle as zoning is. So what has happened in Montgomery County is traditional mainline white Protestant church goes out of business. They sell to an ethnic church, which is growing, and this is a real case. It actually involved the United Methodists. They sold the property for a reasonable amount of money. Then the county came in and said, you've got to make $2 million in improvements in building codes if you're going to be opening this up as a church. And the Ethiopian church it was just got totally surprised by that. So I'm saying your question's a really good question. An alternate question is, and what about building codes? And that's, in my opinion, even a bigger issue than the zoning.
Joe, you had one more?
Oh, I have the microphone. I'm Holly Baldwin. I'm a staff planner for City of Cambridge in Dorchester County. So we have a district within our city that we've got mixed-use zoning in that has, I would say, a concentration of churches that we've heard are struggling with, maintaining their buildings, dwindling congregations. So one of the things we've done is made sure to have mixed-use zoning, but what we're finding is that as we are looking at the different mixed use of institutional, commercial. We're finding that sometimes neighboring communities are becoming concerned with like different overlays. So my question is two-part: are you having experience with like neighbor conflict as far as when mixed use comes up? And also, the second part is, have you had specific examples of like how things planning and zoning like might be missing when it comes to reusing institutional buildings for mixed use, or specific regulations that you've seen are helpful or have made it a little bit easier?
I'll make a quick quip on that, and is that every single time, yes, that's an issue. The neighbors don't want anything different to happen, and at least some portion of the neighbors are vocal in opposing any accommodation to what the new development plan might be, and sometimes they can be convinced of the value of the project if there's good relations in place. And so that's the thing that we stress most, that's the thing the local church can do, is the clergy and the lay leaders can go out and talk to their neighbors and share their vision as to what it is they're trying to accomplish in a way that hopefully overcomes some of the stereotypes. But there are all kinds of weapons that can be used against such a project, including like historical designations of properties that makes doing anything with them pretty difficult.
Your points are very well taken. Two things. You think churches know their neighbors, right? They don't. They absolutely don't. Vineland, New Jersey, kitty corner from City Hall, they don't know who the mayor is. They don't know who their council member is. They don't know that there's a wonderful Main Street program in Vineland, New Jersey, even though they're on the main street. I just can't believe that, but that's absolutely the way it is. And I forgot my second point.
Thank you.